The crisp rustle of paper sliding across a mahogany table cuts through the heavy silence of the cabinet room. It is May 15th, 1940. France is bleeding out. Winston Churchill demands salvation for a breaking ally. But the man sitting opposite him, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, does not deal in political sentiment. He deals in arithmetic. From his uniform pocket, he produces a hand-drawn graph. A single red line plunges downward across the page. It traces a mathematical certainty. If Britain continues feeding Royal Air Force squadrons across the English Channel, in exactly 10 days, 0 hurricanes will remain. He secured his nation's survival in that room, yet by defying the Prime Minister with cold logic, whose career was actually destroyed. It is the autumn of 1916. High above the blood-soaked mud of the Somme. Long before he was the mastermind of Britain's airborne shield, a younger Hugh Dowding served as a commander in the Royal Flying Corps. He watched a generation of aviators feed a mechanized slaughter. The skies over the Western Front were a relentless grinder of men, wood, and canvas. His pilots were flying multiple combat sorties a day, their nerves frayed, their reflexes dulled by profound exhaustion. Dowding saw the breaking point approaching and chose an act of professional heresy. He advocated for the lives of his men over the endless demands of the offensive. He sent a formal request to the High Command, stating plainly that his squadrons required immediate relief. He warned his superiors with uncomfortable clarity, writing, quote, "The continuous strain is breaking the nerves of my pilots." End quote. The military bureaucracy, commanded by generals who viewed casualties as mere accounting adjustments, was appalled by this display of humanity. They granted the operational pause, but the punishment for his bluntness was swift. Dowding was immediately stripped of his command and sent back to England in disgrace. He was sidelined, forced to watch the remainder of the First World War from the periphery. Yet in the quiet isolation of his exile, the foundation of his character hardened into stone. He realized that the institution he served valued blind compliance over preservation. He became a commander who understood the precise gravity of sending young men to die. A harsh lesson was etched permanently into his psyche that year. 2 decades later, he would build a fortress to save those same generals, only to find the exact same knife waiting for his back. How do you build a fortress out of thin air? Between 1936 and 1939, Hugh Dowding did not prepare for a glorious romantic war of individual heroism. He prepared for a mathematical siege. While European politicians celebrated the fragile illusion of peace, he was quietly constructing the world's first integrated air defense network. He envisioned a sprawling, invisible nervous system stretching across the British coastline. The tall steel masts of experimental radar stations would act as the eyes, transmitting electronic pulses far out over the ocean. Subterranean operations rooms and sector stations would serve as the brain, processing a chaotic influx of raw data into calculated, precise fighter deployments. In an era that still romanticized the solitary fighter ace, Dowding understood that the next conflict would be an industrial equation. As he noted in a pre-war memorandum, the survival of the nation relied upon, quote, "the rapid translation of information into interception," end quote. He was actively stripping the poetry from aerial combat, replacing it with rigid, unyielding logistics. He was an architect laying the foundation for a house he did not expect to live in. By all official measures, his time had already expired. His military career was scheduled to conclude permanently in June 1939. Yet as the geopolitical temperature of Europe plummeted, the Air Ministry recognized the irreplaceable value of his meticulous design. They extended his tenure, keeping him at the helm of Fighter Command on borrowed time. His final retirement date was officially pushed to March 1940. He was effectively a ghost commanding a modern army, waiting in the dark for World War II. a conflict that was already ticking down to the final hour. 52. That was the magic number. The precise mathematical threshold between survival and subjugation. Dowding had calculated this exact figure long before the first bombs fell. To secure the skies over the British Isles, Fighter Command required 52 fully operational squadrons. It was not a request born of ambition, but a cold, irreducible equation of national defense. Yet, when the drums of conflict finally sounded in September 1939, he possessed merely 34. In the spring of 1940, the mechanized armor of the Third Reich tore through the Ardennes. The Allied lines fractured. The skies above the continent transformed into a vortex of burning metal and cordite. As the French military apparatus collapsed, the political pressure to hurl Britain's aerial reserves into the continental furnace became immense. From the quiet seclusion of his headquarters at Bentley Priory, Dowding monitored the disintegration of his life's work. He watched, bound by duty, as dozens of irreplaceable hurricanes vanished from the sprawling map tables every single day. The attrition was measurable, clinical, and fatal. His painstakingly hoarded strength, which he had desperately attempted to preserve, was dragged violently back down to 36 squadrons. The arithmetic of ruin was inescapable. In a stark internal assessment, he observed the grim reality, writing, quote, "The continuous drain of our fighter resources will inevitably lead to the defeat of this country," end quote. He was pouring his meticulously trained pilots into a void, feeding a foreign collapse while his own island stood exposed to the impending storm. The defensive shield he had spent 4 years weaving together was unraveling in a matter of weeks. The numbers were bleeding out, yet across the channel, a desperate ally was screaming for more. Who would dare look Winston Churchill in the eye and say no? Quote, "We are defeated," end quote. The voice of French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud crackled through the telephone line to London, heavy with the sudden collapse of a republic. It is May 16th, 1940. Winston Churchill, driven by the fierce romanticism of an alliance, flies to Paris. Surrounded by the drifting smoke of burning government archives, he promises Reynaud 6 more squadrons of British fighters. To the newly appointed Prime Minister, it is a grand, necessary gesture of defiance. To Hugh Dowding, sitting in the cold shadows of his headquarters, it is an act of measurable national suicide. Dowding refuses to let the island's last shield be sacrificed on the altar of political optics. He drafts a stark, dangerously insubordinate letter to the Air Ministry, demanding an immediate, permanent halt to the cross-channel hemorrhage. He writes with the icy precision of a coroner assessing a terminal wound. He warns that if the current political strategy persists, the final, complete, and irremediable defeat of the country is mathematically assured. The escalating tension culminates on June 3rd. Dowding is summoned before the War Cabinet for what will be his final, definitive appearance. He stands alone, a solitary strategist surrounded by desperate statesmen. He does not plead or negotiate. He simply delivers the unyielding burden of arithmetic. Looking directly into the eyes of the men who command the empire, he speaks the grim truth they cannot bear to acknowledge. Quote, "At the rate of losses endured, we shall not have a single hurricane left in France or in this country." End quote. Faced with the undeniable gravity of his logic, the politicians finally yield. Churchill agrees to stop the plans. But in the quiet stillness of that cabinet room, a bitter, unforgiving grudge took root in the Prime Minister's mind. The distinct, heavy drone of enemy engines bleeds through the summer clouds. It is August 1940. The skies above the English Channel transform into a sprawling theater of aerial combat. Operation Eagle Attack commences, bringing the full weight of the Luftwaffe against Britain's coastal defenses.
Checkpoint
Deep underground at Bentley Priory, Hugh Dowding watches the plotting tables. He does not lead glorious cavalry charges. He manages the conflict through cold, calculated resource allocation. By September 1st, the attrition forces a grim administrative decision. Lacking fresh units for 11 Group, Dowding implements a ruthless triage system for his fighter squadrons. He divides them into 3 distinct tiers. Category A for the combat-ready, Category B for those actively rebuilding, and Category C for the broken remnants pulled from the line. The human cost is severe. On September 3rd, Dowding delivers a stark statistical report to Winston Churchill, writing that, quote, "The supply of trained pilots is causing the gravest anxiety," end quote. He details that 25% of Fighter Command's pilots have been lost since July. More critically, 25% of the surviving aviators possess less than 2 weeks of operational flying experience. He is feeding boys into a thresher, balancing the defense of the realm on the shoulders of novices. Then a strategic shift alters the equilibrium. On September 7th, Hermann Goering redirects his focus, dispatching 1,000 bombers toward London. The airfields are spared, but the city burns. Dowding uses this vital reprieve to cycle his exhausted squadrons. His meticulous design absorbs the blow, calculates the interception vectors, and systematically bleeds the German offensive dry. By September 17th, Adolf Hitler formally postpones Operation Sea Lion. The invasion was halted. The builder had saved the house during the Battle of Britain, but the landlords were already changing the locks. What is the exact weight of a father's silence? While Hugh Dowding stood before the War Cabinet, absorbing the bitter resentment of politicians who viewed his arithmetic as cold and unfeeling, a profoundly personal conflict was unfolding beneath the surface of his stoic demeanor. High above the English Channel, woven seamlessly into the daily calculus of interception vectors and casualty reports, was Pilot Officer Derek Dowding. His own flesh and blood was flying with 74 Squadron, thrust directly into the most unforgiving sectors of the sky during the heaviest days of combat. Every time the Air Chief Marshal stared at the sprawling map tables at Bentley Priory, watching the wooden blocks representing 74 squadrons slide toward incoming German bomber formations, he knew he was pushing his child closer to a fiery grave. Yet, Dowding never allowed the agonizing reality of his son's mortality to permeate the walls of the command bunker. He never once leveraged his personal sacrifice to win a strategic argument, nor did he use his child's life as a political bargaining chip to silence his critics. In his official dispatch, he captured the clinical reality of this sacrifice, writing that, quote, "A fresh squadron became depleted and exhausted before any of the resting squadrons was ready to take its place," end quote. He treated his own boy as just another unit in that relentless cycle, an anonymous fraction in the grim equation of national defense. The commander accused of lacking humanity was, in truth, suppressing a profound paternal agony to ensure the preservation of countless other sons. He carried this secret through the autumn winds. But as November approached, the political knives were finally drawn, and his time was rapidly running out. The reward for saving the free world was a pink slip. On November 24th, 1940, the exhaust fumes of the Luftwaffe's daylight offensive had barely dissipated from the English coast. Inside the subterranean concrete bunker at Bentley Priory, the architect of Britain's survival was abruptly terminated. Hugh Dowding was unceremoniously relieved of his command, replaced by Air Vice Marshal Sholto Douglas. This was a commander whose aggressive aerial doctrines were far more palatable to Winston Churchill and the political establishment. The bureaucracy moved with clinical precision to dismantle his legacy. Following the victory, Dowding submitted his official 4-month dispatch, a meticulous operational report detailing the mechanics of the defense. The government deliberately suppressed it. Instead, the Air Ministry commissioned and published its own sterilized history of the Battle of Britain. In a calculated act of institutional amnesia, the resulting pamphlet completely omitted Dowding's name from the narrative of the very campaign he had orchestrated. The betrayal extended beyond the archives. Dowding was explicitly denied elevation to the 5-star rank of Marshal of the Royal Air Force. The Air Council justified this exclusion by citing a rigid protocol, insisting that only the Chief of the Air Staff could hold such a title. It was a convenient administrative barrier that they would readily ignore after the war, breaking their own rule to bestow that exact honor upon his immediate successors. Reflecting on the sudden termination of his career, Dowding summarized his exit with characteristic detachment, writing, quote, "I was given no reasons for my supersession," end quote. They took his desk, his military rank, and his official narrative. Yet the establishment faced an impossible contradiction, attempting to erase the architect while living safely inside the fortress he built. The smell of theatrical smoke and the mechanical whir of 35mm cameras drift across the manicured grass of Hawkinge Airfield. It is the summer of 1968. An 86-year-old Hugh Dowding, now confined to a wheelchair, sits quietly on the set of a motion picture recreating the Battle of Britain. He watches Sir Laurence Olivier don his uniform, stepping into the role of the commander the government tried to erase. Reflecting on the victory that ended his career, he simply stated, quote, "I was merely an instrument," end quote. He requires no validation from the political establishment that betrayed him. The honors they withheld and the records they rewrote mean nothing to a man who knows the exact equation of his nation's survival. He offers only a gentle, knowing smile. It is the quiet grace of an architect who outlived his detractors, perfectly content to let history finally catch up to the arithmetic.